Appalachia, a word that evokes a whole passel of reaction. Everything from the beauty of a mountain top to trailer parks, drugs, and about everything in between. The Appalachian Mountains are indeed the oldest mountains in the world. They once towered 30,000 feet into the air. They stretch from eastern Canada through 14 states all the way to Louisiana. Folks that live in these mountains have faced an unending number of tragic and just plain odd happenings that cry out for the telling. Hello, I'm Larry Bentley, and I was born and raised in these very mountains from folks that were themselves born and raised and lived for generations in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. Come with me and we'll take a look at some of the unending stories that come from within my beloved mountains. And we'll look through the eyes of an Appalachian at some outside the area as well. Welcome to Season 5 of Appalachian Murder, Mystery, and Legend. Howdy, my good friends. I hope you're doing well today. Thank you so much for stopping by. When I look at history, I picture a timeline in my mind of how things took place. April 12th, 1861, the first shots were fired of the kickoff of the Civil War. Now, that war goes on through 1862, 63, and right on up till April 9th, 1865, when Lee surrendered to Grant. Now, I can't help but think, what if it would be somebody come along, be able to go back somewhere along that timeline and be able to do something about stopping all the killing. Same goes for all the pieces of dog squeeze that we talk about in our episodes every week. Maybe if somebody could go back in time and hand Hitler's daddy a condom at the right time, the whole world changes forever. Well, Lydia Danbury was born on December 24th, 1824 in Burlington, New Jersey. She would turn out to be one that Santa Claus should have just hovered his sleigh right over Niagara Falls and dropped the little witch right over the side and been done with it instead of delivering her to her poor parents, where at least the father would live long enough to want to crawl in the hole and pull the hole in after him once he saw the fine young chicken neck piece of work his daughter turned into. Now, so come on in, take your shoes off and set a spell while I lay this one in your lap like a big gray-haired Maine Coon tomcat. Within a year of her birth, Lydia Danbury's mother had died, which back in the day really wasn't uncommon for a Georgian era, I should say, not area, Georgian era, which was about as twice as bad as the Victorian era that came right after it. Kind of makes me wonder if Miss Danbury could see into the future and just decided to hell with it and decided to exit life stage left. Of course, Lydia's father went on and did what most men did back in that day, and it was to remarry. And a lot of them do it today too, but nothing wrong with that. But I couldn't find out how old Lydia was when her old man took his second plunge, but she was blame sure old enough to know that she had no love for a shiny new stepmother. So she chose to live with her Uncle John Claygay, who was a New Brunswick farmer there in New Jersey. At the ripe old age of 16, Lydia met her first husband, Edward Struck, through her association with the Methodist Church. Now, he was widowed, and when his wife died, he became the sole parent of his children. After Lydia and Mr. Struck struck up a relationship, they were married and moved to Harlem, New York, where they had 7 children of their own, 4 girls and 3 boys. Martha, George, Anne, Edward, Josephine, and who only lived to be about a year old or so, Lydia, who I reckon was Lydia Jr., and William. Now, in 1864, just before little William was a year old, Mr. Struck got sick. I mean, got to get better, die to get better sick. That's exactly what happened next, though. After a couple of days, the doctor was signing his death certificate, even though he was stumped as to what killed the man. Most folks that saw him while he was sick, that they thought maybe he'd been poisoned. Lydia said that if he was poisoned, it was because he was too blame stubborn to listen to her and took the wrong medication. Apparently nobody found nothing funny, so they dragged him out the back door and planted him in the sweet peas out back and called it a day. I reckon somebody missed something because over the next 2 years, every single solitary child in the house was dead, and all of them had died suddenly, just about the same way as Mr. Struck did. Most of their death certificates listed typhoid fever as the cause of death because back then typhoid was touring the country like Lester Flatt, Earl Scruggs, and the Foggy Mountain Boys did back in 1969. Back then, there wasn't no government assistance, so folks that fell on hard times had to pull up the bootstraps and get plumb mad dog tough. So the poor childless widow, Lydia Struck, finally got her position as a housekeeper in Stratford, Connecticut. I reckon she must have stopped flying around on her broomstick long enough to use it to sweep the floors, and that impressed somebody enough to hire her. Wasn't long before a friend, yeah, that's what I thought too. You mean she's got one of them left still alive? But she did. And, well, this friend introduced her to Dennis Hurlbut. Now, folks around the area called him Old Hurlbut. Dennis was a pretty well-off farmer who also dabbled in real estate, but was a bit of a tightwad with his money. But he must have liked Lydia's hollow-eyed, gaunted looks and hired her for his own housekeeper, which probably required a little bit more of a buzzardly type personal touch, which Lydia happened to specialize in. Wasn't long before they fell in love and married in 1868. Shortly after their marriage, old Hurlbut, well, he updated his will and made Lydia his sole heir. Then he may as well have left the lawyer's office and went straight to the closest mortuary, went inside, laid down on the slab, and shoved the embalming probes into his own neck and hit the start button because he was a dead man walking, and the ink wasn't even dry yet. Just about as soon as he got home and showed Lydia the paperwork, his health started a death spiral that it wasn't long before he was circling the drain like a turd in a toilet bowl. Now, it don't say that Lydia called for a doctor, but it does say that a doctor was sent for. But that makes me wonder if somebody didn't see old Hurlbut doing the zombie waltz around the house and sent for Dr. Church, who was the local doctor. He was told to get over to the Hurlbut place because old Hurlbut was suffering acute pains in the head and stomach and violent fever. Dr. Church saw old Hurlbut all stofed up in the bed, pale as a sheet, sweating like a holiness preacher in a brothel in New Orleans, and he was so bothered by it that he asked several other doctors to come and take a look at him. Like we talked about in previous episodes, doctors back then would get together and try to make sure that they wasn't looking at what maybe down the barrel would be some kind of a bad epidemic that was coming on. By the time they all got there, old Hurlbut was already cold and in the ground, while Lydia sat there with an even longer face than she already had. Now, being 2 strikes down in the count on men, Lydia moved on and did the best she could with a load of money until she met Horatio Nelson Sherman in Derby, Connecticut. Now, probably about the time she was ready to run out of money, if I had to guess. He was known as a skilled mechanic. That wasn't something to sneeze at back then. A whole lot of machinery back in the day was pretty complicated and not like today's mechanical assemblies. You could have one little shim or washer out of place, and the whole thing would beat itself into a pile of scrap right in front of you, making you look dumber than a sack full of hammers if you didn't know what you were doing. But Mr. Sherman, who went by Nelson, was also known to be what they call faultlessly generous. And it just so happened that he was a widower and had been left with 4 children, Horatio Nelson Jr., Addie, Nathaniel, and 15-month-old Frankie. So, he hadn't been a widower all that long, and apparently hadn't looked very hard to find anybody else. Probably tried to find somebody that looked a lot like his dead wife, and he found the only one that looked dead when he found Lydia. But Mr. Sherman found that he couldn't resist Lydia's bird legs, humped back, and chicken neck. So after a short courtship, they jogged down to church, filled out all the marriage paperwork, and went through with the nuptials in September of 1870. Unfortunately for everybody involved in their newly wedded family, happiness took a break for it at the church and never made it home with them because it wasn't long before Nelson was severely depressed. I was thinking that it was due to maybe buyer's remorse, but it was due to the sudden death of 15-month-old Frankie. Then, right about midway of his grieving process, 14-year-old Addie dropped over out of the blue yonder. Now, that was all pumped up a notch by the fact that Lydia and Nelson weren't sleeping in the same bedroom because they weren't getting along. And that was due to the fact that she hadn't got pregnant by him. I tend to think that he got a real good look at her and it scared him probably. But Nelson took up the bottle and commenced drinking after that. In May of 1871, he got together with several of his drinking buddies and took off to the town of New Haven, which was a party town, so that he could tie on a good drunk. That meant Lydia was left all alone to take care of his two remaining children, Nelson Jr. and Nathaniel. Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, that she sure enough was going to take care of. But a week later, they were still alive, and, well, Nelson still hadn't come home. Could have been that if Lydia hadn't had her stepson go dig him out of a ditch, ragdoll him up on the back of a buckboard and haul him back home, he might have stayed gone. But when he got home, Lydia was pretty blame mad because he was falling down crying drunk. He was in such bad shape that he couldn't even go back to work for nigh on a week. Once he did finally go back to work, he absolutely refused to go home to eat anything. Now, sounds to me like he just may have suspected that Lydia's recipe might have been responsible for thinning out his family, and he didn't want to be the next one in a pine box moving feet first toward a hole in the backyard. Lydia was a right smart ill at him, but from what everybody said that I could find, she still cared about him and tried to take care of him. Yeah, apparently she had everybody fooled by sending him meals and drinks, which he started finally eating and drinking. On June 1st, he drank a drink that Lydia had sent him, and 2 hours later he was staggering around with a granddaddy of a headache, raging fever, and cramps. 2 days later, he was dead from what the doctor described as suffering dreadful agony. But he wasn't yet in the pine box, headed feet first for a hole in the ground. Seems that the symptoms that Nelson suffered were from exactly the same as the ones that his children suffered from, and before they died. That caused his doctor to wonder what was causing the death. So he decided that he'd better get to the bottom of this before more people caught whatever it was and expired on it. So he ordered an autopsy for Nelson, and as we all know, even back then the stomach and liver was removed from, while Lydia paced a hole in the living room floor, sweating bullets, and the good doctor boxed him up and sent him over to Nelson's drinking ground in New Haven for analysis, because there was a medical college over there. Now, it took 3 weeks to do a complete rundown on both of them, and believe it or not, they could detect quite a few things back then. That was a result of a growing epidemic of poisons that was taking place during that time in history. In fact, so many poisonings took place that arsenic became known as the divorce powder. Now, when the report came back, the doctor had to pick his false teeth up off his desk and slap them back in because he was shocked. Nelson's liver was saturated with enough arsenic to kill 3 big strapping lumberjacks. I reckon after the doctor had a short shot or two, maybe of whiskey, to still his nerves because he probably couldn't believe that Nelson had been poisoned and that he was a doctor that had missed it, he ran down to the sheriff's office and preached the gospel of Nelson Sherman's arsenic-riddled liver to the sheriff, which meant that it was just a matter of time before they had enough evidence to hang it all on Lydia. I figured they would hang it on her raven's bill of a nose because it would stay there if it was hung there anyway. As they started digging and investigating, detectives were out following Lydia through every move she made, and she went right on with life like nothing ever happened and didn't have a care in the world. Detectives called Nelson's friends in and talked to them. That got police to thinking that Nelson might not be the only one to consume Lydia's little recipe and wind up with a dirt nap situation. So they decided to exhume Nelson's 2 children, all while Lydia just kept on saddlebagging it around town. Apparently, she must have checked her crystal ball, flew over to the cemetery on her broom, or maybe heard it through the grapevine that Nelson's kids were being dug up for autopsy because she hot-footed it for New Brunswick. She just happened to depart right when the test results came in on the youngin's liver. Of course, they were full of arsenic too. That's when they sent detectives over to New Brunswick to arrest her and drag her back in cuffs. When they got there, she had already took off with her sister, Miss Neffy, to a train trip to Philadelphia. So the police stood there waiting until she came back on the 10:50 morning train. They leaped on the train before it completely stopped, pounced on, arrested, and dragged her to District Attorney Herbert's office, where she was held until 4 o'clock that evening, when then thrown onto a train and brought back to New Haven by her escorts, Sheriff Blakeman and Detective Mitchell. Then word got out of Lydia's arrest. It was headlines in dang near every newspaper across the whole country. Hardly a day went by without the name Lydia Sherman being splattered all over the front pages. Some of them headlines called her the wickedest woman, America's Queen Poisoner, the Poison Fiend, and the Derby Poisoner. She was described as having squinted eyes, sunk back into a rat-like face with a lipless slit for a mouth. And just like always, back in the day, folks were plumb fascinated by her murder trial, which culminated in the reason to have the end of the world party again they always had back then. Her trial was held before Judge Platt in Birmingham, starting in July 6, 1871. As the trial went on, folks watched Lydia's behavior. They said that the woman was as stoic and indifferent as the day was long. That, despite all the evidence in the world being held right under her long nose over and over again, showing her to be a murderer. Now, the prosecution said that she killed no less than 3 husbands along with 8 children, and when she lived in Connecticut, which is a state famous for its ease of divorce. It's odd that she'd prefer to rid herself of her husband by murder instead of the safe and easy process of the courts. And it's just as inconceivable that her dislike for her own offspring was so that they had to be disposed of like garbage because they were nothing more to her than excess baggage left over from a triple train wreck that she created. Now, the doctors, except for the last one, of course, that attended Lydia's family over the years, might have been fooled by what was going on, but the jury sure wasn't. They were convinced that she was guilty. They sentenced her to life in Wethersfield prison in Connecticut on April 25th, 1872, for murdering Nelson. He was the only one she was tried for. Now, the only reason that she didn't do her final dance at the end of a 13-foot piece of Kentucky hemp was that they found her guilty of second-degree murder. Now, we got to understand how the world worked back then. Juries back in the day rarely convicted women of first-degree murder because hanging a woman complicated things back then. Nobody wanted to do it, see it, or be involved in it. Besides the fact that if they did, most of the time, the governor of a given state would just commute the sentence to life without parole, or maybe with parole in most cases. This one made the whole country feel like they just ate a sandwich that somebody gave them, made us scrapings right out of a cat's litter box, because there was overwhelming evidence that she'd flat out poisoned a slew of people, and there wasn't a single redeeming quality in the woman that anybody could find to mitigate any of it. After her sentencing, she wrote out a confession. She admitted to killing her children, her stepchildren, and her husband. She admitted to killing everybody but old Hurlbut. She said that he got sick after putting saleratus in his pint of cider and drinking it. Saleratus is what they used to call bicarbonate of soda, folks. Of course, she did say that sprinkling arsenic in saleratus into food and drink of the victims is how she got rid of them. She did add that she killed them to keep them from suffering the embarrassment of the town. Yeah, folks, she done them a favor. She done it for them. After Lydia was locked up and published her confession, she wasn't heard of again for 7 years. That's when, on May 27th of 1877, she made a run for it. She slipped out of her cell and hopped a train to Springfield, Massachusetts. I imagine the worst fear for police was that she took up a job as a cook somewhere. She got away because of her cell door was pretty much left unlocked all the time. They left it that way because with what they called her precarious health. Apparently, they didn't know what she always looked like. She always looked like walking death. Lydia first reared her head in Worcester and then moved on to Providence, Rhode Island, where she checked into a Central Hotel as a Miss Brown from Philadelphia. That's where she found a friend named Miss Sears, who was the hotel's landlady. Now, the genius forgot that she'd signed in using the name Miss Brown and told Miss Sears that her name was Miss Moore. Unfortunately for Lydia, Miss Sears was a true crime junkie way before it was cool. She'd been reading about the escape of Lydia Sherman and figured that she ought to call the police, which she promptly did. They showed up and questioned Lydia while they searched her possessions. That's where they found a napkin ring with the name Lydia engraved on it. And before the officers could even say anything, she said, "Yeah, but it don't say Sherman," before the officers brought up the name Sherman even at all. With that, they pounced on her and dragged her back to Withersfield Prison. Now, on May 16th, 1878, the next time anybody heard anything from her, she had died, and she'd been ill for a spell, but got worse in the last few weeks. It was reported that she was suffering from an acute liver disease that made her turn yellow. Now, the newspapers got hold of that news and pretty much said it was about time and it was a good thing for the rest of us. I wonder if she got hold of some arsenic just to maybe off herself, or whether it was on purpose or not. Or maybe handling arsenic all them years done some damage, it just couldn't be reversed. Regardless, that was what was in Lydia's little recipe. Folks, I hope you got something out of our story today. If you did, please rate and review the podcast, or if you're watching on Spotify, YouTube, or Rumble, throw us a like, and don't forget to subscribe or follow wherever you're listening or watching. Come on over to Appalachian Murder, Mystery, or Legend Podcast and on Facebook group where we talk Appalachian about anything else you want to talk about. I'll be back real soon with another Appalachian Murder, Mystery, or Legend, and I will see you then.